Every F-35 fighter jet rolling off the Lockheed Martin production line contains about 920 pounds of rare earth materials. Every Tomahawk cruise missile needs samarium cobalt magnets to function. Every satellite the Pentagon launches depends on elements you've probably never heard of: dysprosium, neodymium, terbium. And here's the uncomfortable reality that keeps defense planners up at night. China controls not 50%, not 70%, but 92% of the world's rare earth processing capacity. Not mining, processing. That's the part most people miss. So, how did the world's most powerful military become dependent on its primary strategic competitor for the very materials that make its weapons work? And why is the Pentagon scrambling, some would say panicking, to find alternatives that may take a decade to develop? That's what I'm going to break down today. Because this isn't just about minerals in the ground. This is about the most sophisticated resource strategy any nation has executed in the last 50 years. And most Western analysts completely misunderstand how it works. Here's what the mainstream narrative gets wrong. They'll tell you China got lucky with geology, that they have the biggest deposits. That's partially true. China holds about 37% of known global reserves. But Vietnam has 18%. Brazil has significant deposits. The United States has Mountain Pass in California with substantial reserves. So why does China dominate? Because rare earth dominance was never about rocks. It was about three interlocking systems that Beijing spent 40 years building while the West wasn't paying attention. Let me show you what I mean. The three systems are strategic patience in industrial policy, processing chokepoint control, and what I call the environmental arbitrage strategy. Together, they created a dependency so deep that even the Pentagon admits it will take until 2035 at minimum to achieve anything close to supply chain independence. Let's start with the first system, strategic patience in industrial policy. In 1987, Deng Xiaoping made a statement that's now famous in resource circles. He said, "The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths." But what people don't realize is what happened next. This wasn't empty rhetoric. It was the launch of a 40-year strategy that most democracies are structurally incapable of executing. Here's how it actually worked. When I was in Baotou, Inner Mongolia, a few years ago, that's the rare earth capital of the world, I talked to a refinery manager who'd been in the industry since the early 90s. What he described was systematic. The government didn't just subsidize mining. They subsidized below-cost selling for years. Decades. Between 1990 and 2005, Chinese rare earth prices dropped by 95%. Not because of efficiency gains, because Beijing was willing to lose money for 15 years to destroy foreign competition. And it worked. In 1984, the United States was essentially self-sufficient in rare earths. Mountain Pass Mine in California was the world's leading producer. By 2002, it was bankrupt, closed. Couldn't compete with Chinese prices that didn't follow any market logic. The same story played out in Australia, India, South Africa. One by one, non-Chinese rare earth operations shut down, not because they ran out of ore, because they couldn't survive a competitor who didn't need to make a profit. Most people think X, that free markets always win because they're efficient. But here's what's really happening. Strategic state capitalism can sacrifice short-term returns for long-term dominance in ways that quarterly earnings-focused Western companies simply cannot match. The numbers tell the story. In 1990, China produced 27% of global rare earths. By 2010, it was 97%. They quite literally cornered a market that makes modern technology function. And here's the part that should surprise you. This wasn't hidden. It wasn't secret. Chinese government documents openly discuss the rare earth strategy. Western governments watched it happen. American companies lobbied against tariffs that might have protected domestic production because they wanted cheap inputs. We optimized for efficiency. Beijing optimized for control. And when you're playing different games, the one who understands the real game wins. But strategic patience was just the foundation. The second system is even more sophisticated, and it's the one that makes most Western analysts completely miss what's actually happening. Because controlling mines is one thing. What China did with processing is something else entirely. So here's the second force at work, and this one operates completely differently from anything the West anticipated. I call it processing chokepoint control. And if you want to understand why the Pentagon is genuinely panicking, not concerned, not worried, panicking, You need to understand the difference between mining rare earths and actually turning them into something useful. Here's what nobody tells you. Rare earths aren't actually rare. That's the great irony of the name. Cerium is more abundant in the Earth's crust than copper. Neodymium is more common than lead. You can find rare earth deposits on every continent. The United States has them. Australia has them. Canada, Greenland, Brazil, they all have them. So why does it matter that China dominates? Because having the ore is worthless without the capacity to process it. Let me show you the numbers that matter. There are 17 rare earth elements. To separate them from each other, because they occur together in nature and have almost identical chemical properties, requires a process called solvent extraction. It takes thousands of stages. It produces massive amounts of toxic and radioactive waste. It requires specialized knowledge that takes years to develop. And here's the critical figure. China controls 92% of global rare earth processing, not mining, processing. Even when Western countries mine rare earths, like Australia's Lynas Corporation does, where do you think they send the ore? To China, because there's literally nowhere else with the capacity to refine it at scale. This is the processing choke point, and it's far more powerful than controlling mines. A senior mining executive told me off the record last year that building a rare earth processing facility from scratch takes 7 to 10 years minimum. Not because of construction time, because of permitting, environmental compliance, workforce training, and the thousands of small process optimizations that Chinese facilities refined over decades. Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything about how you understand this situation. In 2010, China demonstrated exactly how powerful this choke point is. There was a diplomatic incident with Japan over disputed islands in the East China Sea. Japan arrested a Chinese fishing boat captain. Within weeks, China quietly halted rare earth exports to Japan. They didn't announce it. There was no official embargo. Shipments just stopped clearing customs. Japan's electronics and automotive industries went into immediate crisis mode. Neodymium prices spiked 750% in months. Japanese manufacturers who had built their entire supply chains around cheap, reliable Chinese rare earths suddenly faced an existential threat. And here's the uncomfortable truth about what happened next. Japan backed down, released the captain. The rare earth shipments resumed. This wasn't hypothetical leverage, it was demonstrated leverage. And every defense ministry in the Western world took notice. The Pentagon's 2021 Supply Chain Review, a 250-page document I've read cover to cover, uses the word vulnerability 47 times when discussing rare earths. That's not bureaucratic caution, that's institutional alarm. Now, you might be thinking, can't Western countries just build their own processing facilities? And technically, yes. This is where the third system comes in, and it's perhaps the most strategically brilliant of all. But first, let me give you a concrete example of what processing dependency actually means for American military readiness. The F-35 Lightning II is the most expensive weapons program in human history. Total program cost $1.7 trillion. Each aircraft contains rare earth permanent magnets in its electrical systems, precision-guided munitions, and radar. Specifically, it needs neodymium iron boron magnets and samarium cobalt magnets. Here's what this actually means. If China restricted rare earth exports tomorrow, not to commercial customers, just to defense applications, Lockheed Martin would face production disruptions within 90 to 180 days. That's not my estimate. That's from a Government Accountability Office report published in 2022. The Virginia-class submarine, same vulnerability. The Aegis missile defense system, same vulnerability. Predator drones, JDAM guidance kits, satellite communications, all dependent on materials processed predominantly in China. I talked to factory workers in Shenzhen last year who manufacture components for rare earth magnets. They were genuinely surprised that Americans didn't understand this vulnerability. One worker told me, "We always assumed you had a backup plan. You're Americans." The uncomfortable silence when I explained we really don't was telling. The Pentagon does have a backup plan now, but it involves mines that won't be operational until 2028, processing facilities that won't reach capacity until 2032, and complete supply chain independence that internal documents suggest won't happen before 2037. And all of this assumes China doesn't deploy the third system, the one that makes building Western alternatives almost impossibly expensive. This is the part that should terrify anyone who understands manufacturing economics. The third system is what I call environmental arbitrage strategy. And this is where China's rare earth dominance transforms from impressive to nearly unassailable. Here's the question nobody in Washington wants to answer honestly. Why did American rare earth production collapse in the first place? The standard narrative says China's low labor costs made competition impossible. That's partially true, but deeply incomplete. The real answer involves a word that makes free market advocates uncomfortable: externalities. Let me show you what this actually means. Rare earth processing is one of the most environmentally destructive industrial activities on Earth. For every ton of rare earth elements produced, the mining process generates approximately 2,000 tons of toxic waste. That includes radioactive thorium and uranium, heavy metals, acids, and fluorides. At Baotou, China's rare earth processing hub, there's a tailings lake that covers 10 square kilometers. Satellite imagery shows it as a massive black scar on the landscape. The surrounding area has cancer rates significantly above the national average. Groundwater contamination extends for miles. Here's the uncomfortable truth that Western environmentalists and defense hawks both avoid. China achieved rare earth dominance partly by accepting environmental devastation that would be illegal and politically impossible in any Western democracy. When Mountain Pass operated in California, it faced constant environmental litigation. When it tried to reopen in 2012, permitting took years. Compliance costs added 30 to 40% to production expenses. Meanwhile, Chinese competitors operated under regulations that were either lax or simply not enforced. This is environmental arbitrage. China essentially subsidized its rare earth industry by externalizing environmental costs onto its own population and ecosystem. Western companies couldn't compete because they were playing by different rules. Rules that reflected genuine environmental concerns, but also created a strategic vulnerability. Most people think markets determine industrial winners, but here's what's really happening. Regulatory asymmetry between nations can function as an invisible subsidy worth billions of dollars annually. The numbers are stark. A 2020 study estimated that environmental compliance adds 22 to 38% to rare earth production costs in jurisdictions with Western standard regulations. That's not a gap, that's a chasm. And here's where the strategic genius becomes apparent. Even if Western nations wanted to rebuild rare earth capacity, accepting the environmental costs, the political backlash, the permitting battles, China could simply drop prices again. They've done it before. In 2015, when Lynas Corporation's Australian processing facility started gaining traction, Chinese rare earth prices mysteriously dropped 40% in 6 months. Lynas nearly went bankrupt. They survived only because the Australian government provided emergency loans, and the Japanese government, still traumatized by the 2010 embargo, became a strategic investor. I talked to a Lynas executive who described those years as trench warfare against an enemy with unlimited ammunition. That's what competing against state-backed environmental arbitrage feels like. Let me give you the specific statistics that defense planners obsess over. The United States currently has exactly one operational rare earth mine, Mountain Pass in California, owned by MP Materials. It produces approximately 15% of global rare earth ore. Sounds promising, right? But here's the number that matters. 100% of Mountain Pass output currently ships to China for processing. America's only rare earth mine sends everything to its primary strategic competitor because there's nowhere else to send it. MP Materials is building a processing facility in Texas. Estimated completion, 2025. Estimated capacity, when fully operational, enough to supply roughly 10% of domestic magnet production needs. That's progress, but it's not independence. The Department of Defense has invested $439 million since 2020 in rare earth supply chain initiatives. The Department of Energy has funded research programs. Congress has passed legislation. But the fundamental math remains brutal. A senior economist told me off the record that reshoring rare earth processing requires not millions, but tens of billions in investment, sustained over 15 to 20 years, with no guarantee of profitability, against a competitor willing to operate at a loss indefinitely. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button, because this connects to something even bigger that affects not just defense, but the entire clean energy transition. And I'll show you in a minute why the three systems I've described create what some analysts are calling the most significant industrial choke point of the 21st century. Because rare earths aren't just about weapons, they're about everything. Let me pull this together because the implications extend far beyond the Pentagon's supply chain concerns. Rare earths sit at the intersection of the two most important technological transitions of our era: military modernization and clean energy. Every electric vehicle motor requires approximately 1 kilogram of rare earth permanent magnets. Every direct drive wind turbine needs 600 kilograms. Every smartphone, every MRI machine, every precision guided munition, all dependent on these 17 elements. And China controls the processing for virtually all of it. This is what I call the rare earth paradox. The technologies the West is betting its future on, EVs, wind power, advanced weapon systems, all depend on supply chains controlled by the nation the West increasingly views as its primary strategic competitor. The weapon that was supposed to create strength became the weakness. Here's what makes people uncomfortable about this situation. There are no quick fixes. The Pentagon knows it. The White House knows it. Every honest analyst knows it. When I was in Beijing last year, I asked a Chinese academic who studies industrial policy why the West didn't see this coming. His answer was simple: you did see it coming. Your companies just decided cheap inputs mattered more than strategic independence. We simply took you at your word. He's not wrong. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, American companies actively lobbied against policies that might have preserved domestic rare earth capacity. They wanted cheap materials for their products. They got them. They also got strategic dependency. So what happens next? Let me give you 3 scenarios that analysts are actively gaming out. Scenario 1, managed dependency. This is the current trajectory. Western nations accept partial vulnerability while slowly building alternative supply chains. Processing facilities come online in Texas, Estonia, Australia over the next decade. Dependency decreases from 92% to perhaps 60% by 2035. China retains leverage, but doesn't fully exploit it to avoid triggering accelerated Western decoupling. This is the optimistic scenario. Scenario 2, strategic restriction. A Taiwan crisis or other major geopolitical rupture triggers Chinese export controls on rare earths. Not a total embargo, that would be too obvious, but licensing requirements, quotas, processing delays. Western defense production faces immediate constraints. EV and wind turbine manufacturing slows dramatically. Prices spike 300 to 500%. This accelerates alternative supply development, but causes years of industrial disruption first. Scenario 3, technological disruption. This is the wild card. Research into rare earth alternatives, iron nitride magnets, grain boundary diffusion techniques that reduce rare earth content by 30%, recycling technologies that recover materials from electronic waste, achieves breakthrough success. Dependency decreases not through new mines, but through reduced demand. Some analysts give this a 15 to 20% probability within 10 years. Here's what matters for understanding where this goes. China has demonstrated willingness to use rare earth leverage. They did it against Japan in 2010. They've threatened it during subsequent diplomatic tensions. The question isn't whether they have the capability. The question is under what circumstances they deploy it. The Pentagon's current strategy involves stockpiling, allied cooperation with Australia and Canada, and accelerated domestic processing. But internal documents acknowledge a critical vulnerability window extending until at least 2030. During that window, a serious disruption could constrain American military operations. Let me leave you with the framework that ties this together. I call it the Chokepoint triad: strategic patience, processing control, environmental arbitrage. These 3 systems working together created a dependency that took 40 years to build and will take at least 15 years to partially unwind. Understanding this triad explains why China's rare earth dominance isn't an accident of geology or luck. It's the result of long-term strategic planning that exploited Western assumptions about free markets, short-term thinking, and regulatory asymmetry. This is the part that should surprise you about your own assumptions. The United States didn't lose rare earth independence because China cheated. It lost because American companies made rational short-term decisions that created irrational long-term vulnerabilities. And the system that allowed those decisions was supposed to be America's greatest strength. Now I want to hear from you. In the comments, tell me, do you think Western nations can rebuild rare earth independence before the next major geopolitical crisis? Or has China created a permanent strategic advantage? I read every comment, and this debate matters. If you learned something today, subscribe and hit the notification bell. I break down geopolitical and economic shifts like this every week, the uncomfortable truths that mainstream coverage misses, and share this with someone who needs to understand why 17 obscure elements might shape the 21st century more than oil ever shaped the 20th.